Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 14th of September, where we are continuing our conversation about what is Gothic literature or what is supernatural literature. And we talked a little bit about Stephen King's perspective in Danse Macabre last class. And of course, Stephen King is a contemporary author who would have been very much influenced by some of the authors of the past. It's one of the reasons why I put our readings in chronological order so that you could see how past authors have influenced present authors. And one of the most important authors from the past, certainly in terms of analyzing Gothic literature, would be H.P. Lovecraft. And Lovecraft also is a short story writer, and we will be reading some of his short stories as the semester progresses. But I wanted us to read his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which laid the foundation for the tradition, and that Stephen King would have been quite aware of as he was writing Danse Macabre. As you know, the styles are quite different between Stephen King, who's much more accessible and colloquial, as opposed to Lovecraft, who's much more formal, very much wants to be an Anglophile. So he oftentimes, even though as an American, he shouldn't be using British spellings, he will use British spellings. And we also see how he likes to name drop. So there are quite a few references to texts that we've probably never heard of or have never read. And I wanted you to approach this essay not by feeling compelled to understand every single word, but to get a holistic sense of what it was that Lovecraft was arguing about the genre, so that when we begin to actually start to read texts next week, we can see whether or not we agree or disagree with King and or Lovecraft about their perspectives. So in this essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, Lovecraft argues that fear is the oldest emotion, and hence it's also one of the strangest emotions. I suppose we could talk about at birth, the child, as the child enters into the world, cries because of fear. And that the biggest fear, from Lovecraft's perspective, is the idea of the unknown, that which is uncertain because of the danger associated with it, which is related to what Stephen King was talking about as well, that we basically fear death. And that the oldest and strangest fear began with our primitive forefathers, so this idea of the unknown, which is one of the reasons why, at least according to Lovecraft, we are hardwired for fear of the dark, for instance, because the dark brings so much unknown. Now, in terms of using language, I've been using horror, I've been using supernatural horror, and I've also been using Gothic. And Lovecraft also introduces us to a few terms. Macabre, which you might have heard of previously, that which is gruesome or horrifying or grotesque. Or the weird, you might have heard about the weird tale, that it suggests something that's supernatural, that defies the laws of natural order, something that is unearthly or uncanny. And according to Lovecraft, the reader is required to have both imagination when they're reading these texts and also detachment from everyday life. Because ultimately we're reading about things that don't necessarily exist in our real world, though I had suggested that while we can read all these texts literally, they also are symbolic, suggestive, representational of things that very much exist in our real world. So, the first chapter in Lovecraft's essay is an introduction, and he talks a little bit about the importance of the atmosphere of dread for the supernatural horror tale, something that I was referencing last class as well with environment, and talking a little bit about Halloween, which gives you a good idea about how important the atmosphere is in order to evoke that emotion of fear or dread. And that there's a long literary tradition of Gothic examinations, and I had referenced this somewhat as well in my last video. Beowulf, for instance, and Grendel, and Beowulf's mother, the monstrosities. Dr. Faustus, who is a scholar who is basically compelled, from his perspective, to make a deal with the devil in order to acquire infinite knowledge. Let's just say that the deal doesn't go well. This was a play that was written by Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, but definitely Mephistopheles and the supernatural play a large role in that particular drama. And even something like Macbeth, as I had mentioned, and Shakespeare's dabbling in the supernatural, whether it be the Three Witches or, let's say, Hamlet's ghost in Hamlet. So the first Gothic novel, and I had also mentioned this last class, was The Castle of Otranto. And again, I've included the link in the notes below. Not a particularly well-written text, but it does establish many of the Gothic traditions. Castles, for instance, and that can be modernized into something like haunted houses, as we will see with The Haunting of Hill House. A villain, and then usually some persecuted heroine. In the Gothic tradition, the female is oftentimes quite passive, and we'll talk about that further as the semester progresses. A hero, and as well that strange atmosphere that I was referencing before with fog, trapdoors, creaking hinges, strange lights, things of that nature. Atmosphere that's also been embraced by mystery novels. And I think I might have mentioned last class that Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, has been credited with creating the first modern-day mystery novel, so it's not surprising that there are connections between the two. Chapter 5 in Lovecraft's essay talks a little bit about the aftermath of Gothic fiction, probably the most seminal text in the Gothic tradition. Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we will be reading both of them. In Chapter 7, Lovecraft talks about his great respect for Edgar Allan Poe. And one of the reasons why he respects Poe is because of Poe's standard of realism in his texts and his use of psychology. So if you've ever read any Poe before, then you know that Poe's texts can be written or can be read from a literal supernatural perspective, but they can also be read from a psychological perspective of a descent into madness. Not quite sure which is worse. And in terms of Poe's works, according to Lovecraft, Poe was the standard to aspire to. So one of the things that we'll do is not only read Poe, but eventually read Lovecraft and see if Lovecraft was able to live up to that particular standard. Things like The Mask of the Red Death or The Fall of the House of Usher. In Chapter 8, Lovecraft talks about the weird tradition in America. So while certainly the Gothic tradition began in Europe, we see how it would have translated over or transferred over into the United States with authors not just like Poe, but also James's Turn of the Screw, which I wish we would have had time to read, a very famous ghost story. Or perhaps you've read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper as well, and that also is quite Gothic. The weird tradition in Britain and the British Isles. So that would include texts such as Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, another excellent Gothic text that I wish we had time for, though when we get to Lovecraft, we'll talk about how he was influenced by The Picture of Dorian Gray in his short story, Pickman's Model. And also, of course, Dracula, one of those seminal Gothic texts. And according to Lovecraft, the best horror tales have a sense of naturalness to them. Again, that's one of the reasons why he admired Edgar Allan Poe. A sense of convincingness to them. An artistic smoothness to them. So in other words, there was a superiority of writing. A skillful artistry with technique. A level of craftsmanship that you wouldn't necessarily find in your average text. Psychological knowledge and exotic atmosphere, and ultimately some sort of supernatural element, though I had discussed in the last video that the supernatural element can oftentimes be undercut with ambiguity, so that if a reader doesn't necessarily want to accept the supernatural, they can accept another interpretation. So all of this is basically foundation for our first text, which happens to be Frankenstein. And you'll notice that I've devoted 2 weeks to Frankenstein. We're starting Frankenstein on the 19th, and we will continue talking about Frankenstein until the 28th. So ideally what would happen is that you would finish Frankenstein in its entirety on the 19th, so that as we are talking about Frankenstein in class, you are reading the next text. However, I know that the ideal is not always possible. So read as much as you can, And you'll see that I've included a link to Frankenstein and Gutenberg, so that if it turns out that you don't have access to the text, you can at least read the text online. And your first journal, which will be on Frankenstein, won't be due until the 28th, because by that point we would have put some closure onto Frankenstein. So these two readings, Danse Macabre and Supernatural Horror and Literature, were meant to establish the foundation for the Gothic text we're going to be reading over the course of the semester. So you don't have a journal based on Danse Macabre. You don't have a journal based on Supernatural Horror and Literature. That said, you can certainly use the information from both of those texts throughout the course of the semester in your journals or even in your papers. And for the journal, again, what I was thinking is about a page response or so to each of the major Gothic texts. So when it comes to Frankenstein, I'm assuming that you would submit in about a page or so, but as long or as short as it needs to be. But a page is a good beginning, let's say, for you to begin to contemplate some of the ideas and themes in the text. I think of it as perhaps your note-taking. So the journals don't even necessarily have to be written in complete sentences. They can be written in bullet form. So as you are reading, I suggest that you note ideas and questions, because questions in literature are sometimes more interesting than the answers that you would find in literature. And anything else that seems to have some kind of relevance to you. Now, of course, you can utilize things such as our class discussion forums, and also you can utilize such things as the class videos to help inform your journals as well, which is why the journal is not due until the ending of the unit of Frankenstein. That said, you could certainly hand in your journal early. And I'm not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics. I'm purely evaluating it for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. Hence, I'll be using a checkmark system where a plus is excellent or a check plus is good. And what you will see throughout the course of the semester is by the ending of the semester, you will have some good commentary about all of the major Gothic texts that we've read. Certainly, this could be useful in writing a paper, because while I will be supplying you with paper topics as the semester progresses, you can also create your own, as long as you have the paper assignment approved by me beforehand. So you can use the journals as a way to try out ideas for papers. And the final examination is an essay exam that's open book, open notes. So you can utilize things such as your journals and your papers. So in terms of thinking about Frankenstein, one of the ways that you can perhaps consider this text is thinking about how it does fit into the definitions of Gothic that Stephen King has established, and the definition of Gothic that Lovecraft has established. But as we'll talk about with Frankenstein, there's a lot of different ways to read this text. One of the things that I had mentioned is that genres oftentimes are blended in the Gothic tradition, and while Frankenstein is oftentimes considered to be a horror novel, it also is considered to be science fiction. So that's another idea for you to consider as you are reading the text. Yet a third idea to consider when you're reading the text, because not only is Frankenstein done in science fiction classes, but it's also read in women in literature classes. In fact, I assign it in my own women in literature class from the 1800s, that we've got a female author, Mary Shelley, who's writing a text that's very male-centric. And that's yet another way of examining this text. And Mary Shelley was married to Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet. She was very well schooled in the history of literature and will make quite a few literary references in Frankenstein. In fact, that's the way that we're going to begin, is with the title page and talking about the title itself, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, and then talking about some of the initial quotes that she offers us. So probably you're best familiar with, or you're most familiar with, Frankenstein through media and popular culture, and that would probably be film. And that's something else that we are going to be discussing, especially the 1930s Boris Karloff version of Frankenstein, and how that helped to influence our perception of Frankenstein, which is quite different from what Mary Shelley presented us with in the novel. So we've got all of these ideas to contemplate as we are reading Frankenstein over the next couple of classes, while you're also beginning to think about journals as well. So I'm hopeful that by this point in the semester, everybody has done all of their adding and their dropping and they've settled in, so that we can begin in earnest next week and start talking about Frankenstein. Again, read as much as you can over the course of the 2 weeks. The more, the better. And what you will find is, in some ways, a very complicated narrative. I know that many times students start reading Frankenstein and they wonder, am I reading the right book? Because we are introduced to characters that the cinema has never introduced us to, or usually doesn't introduce us to. Certainly not 1930 cinema. Characters such as Walton, for instance. That's a very deliberate technique that Mary Shelley is using. Something else to consider is that the novel is named Frankenstein, which is the name of the creator, not the name of the creature. The creature is never given a name. So that's something else to sort of tuck away in the back of your mind as you're reading the novel, which is presented to us in letters. There is a term for that. It's called the epistolary novel. And it was a very common writing technique at the time, but as we'll talk about next class, it also is a very useful technique for giving us a Gothic tale. It also helps to complicate the narrative as well. So in terms of today's discussion question, and that would be due on Friday the 16th at 8 a.m., the question is, how would you define Gothic literature and why? How would you define Gothic literature and why? And of course, we've talked a little bit about Stephen King, we've talked a little bit about Lovecraft, I've talked a little bit about my own perceptions. But after all of this, and of course your own readings and your own understanding, what kind of definition would you give? And as I indicated with the discussion forums, that counts as your class attendance, and that you're not required to respond to any of your classmates, but I encourage you to respond to your classmates the way you might respond to somebody in a face-to-face class. But I do want you to read all of your classmates' responses and all of my responses to those responses. So I would have already done that to the introductions, and I will be doing that with the question I left you with the previous discussion forum about fear and what is fear. So I do read everything that you write. And hopefully by being able to read everyone's comments, we can simulate on some level the kind of class discussion that we would have had. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class when we could begin with our first Gothic text, Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.